In this video, I'm going to talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So to start, photosynthesis, remember, happens in a chloroplast. So this is meant to represent a chloroplast. It's a very rough sketch. There are two main steps for photosynthesis, two major phases. There is the light reaction and there is the Calvin cycle. So you may recall that in the light reaction, water and light are needed and oxygen is a product. ATP and NADPH are also products and they're used for the Calvin cycle. In the Calvin cycle, carbon dioxide is used in carbon fixation and glucose is a product. NADP plus and ADP and PI are also products and they're needed for the light reaction. So these two processes are interdependent on each other. The light reaction happens in the thylakoids and the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, which is the space around the thylakoids. So the equation for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water plus light makes glucose and oxygen, and we can see all of that in this picture above. As a side note, this process first evolved in prokaryotes. And it's prokaryotes doing photosynthesis that made our atmosphere oxygen rich, so made it possible for organisms like humans that depend on oxygen to evolve. A little bit more detailed picture of a chloroplast. So a chloroplast has two membranes. It's a double membrane structure. It actually has like a third membrane structure too, the thylakoid. The thylakoids each have their own membrane, and there's stacks of thylakoids in the chloroplast called granum. And the space in between the thylakoids is called the stroma. And remember, that's where Calvin cycle takes place, and the light reaction happens in the thylakoid. So we're going to talk about the light-dependent reaction first, but before we do, I want to remind you of absorption spectrums. So we looked at this when we were learning about why leaves change color in the fall, and we learned that when we're looking at an absorption spectrum, what we're seeing is what colors are reflected versus what colors are absorbed. So wavelengths of light correspond to color. So we have purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, red here. And I've represented the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll B and chlorophyll A. There's two different types of chlorophyll. And as you can see, both chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B have these peaks in the purple-blue region and in the red region. So what that means is those chlorophyll pigments are absorbing the wavelengths at these two regions. So they're absorbing purple-blue and they're absorbing orange red. So think for a second what color that means those two pigments are. So hopefully you got green, right? Chlorophyll is green, and the reason is the green light is reflected to our eyes, so we see chlorophyll as green. That's why we see plants as green. So the light that's actually being absorbed in the light-dependent reaction is more in the purple, blue, and red spectrum. So in the light-dependent reaction, we're in a thylakoid. In the membrane of the thylakoid, there's all these proteins that help the light-dependent reaction happen. So the first thing is that light hits photosystem 2 and excites an electron from a chlorophyll pigment. That excited electron then moves through the electron transport chain to photosystem 1. When that electron leaves photosystem 2, it's replaced by an electron from water, which is split into electrons, oxygen, and hydrogen. The energy from the electron moving through the electron transport chain pumps hydrogen ions, aka protons, into the thylakoid space. Light hits photosystem 1 and excites another electron on a chlorophyll pigment, and that electron leaves. This time the electron is replaced by one from photosystem 2 that's come through the electron transport chain. The electron that was excited in photosystem 1 goes to NADP reductase, which combines that electron with NADP plus and hydrogen to make NADPH. So NADPH is carrying that high energy electron. Then the high concentration of hydrogen plus ions, aka protons, that have built up in the middle here of the thylakoid space, rush out of the ATP synthase, and they provide the energy for ADP to be combined with inorganic phosphate to make ATP. So that's how ATP is made in the light-dependent reaction. So the ATP and the NADPH then go to the Calvin cycle where they are needed. So just as a quick aside, so oxygen, the reason oxygen is something that plants make is from this step, from the water splitting. Okay, so the Calvin cycle, which is happening in the stroma, involves carbon dioxide from the air entering the Calvin cycle. Those carbons from CO2 are attached to something called RUBP, which has 5 carbons. We call that step carbon fixation. So this process of this carbon from CO2 being attached to RUBP. So I could even add a picture of that. Then that RUBP plus the CO2, so that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. So then that molecule goes through a number of steps involving ATP energy and electrons from NADPH to convert it into G3P molecules, which have 2 carbons. So for every 6 carbon dioxides that go in, so we'd have 6 rubiscos, we'd have 6 carbon molecules that are made through carbon fixation. For 6 in, we get 2 G3Ps out, and those 2 G3Ps combine to make 1 glucose. So we can kind of follow the number of carbons. So each CO2 has 1 carbon, so that 6 carbons in makes 2 G3Ps, which makes 1 glucose. The rest of the carbon molecules, you may remember those little pop beads we used when we did this in class, are regenerated back into RUBP, and ATP is used as energy for that. So the ATP and NADPH from the light reaction are used in this way, and then the ADP and inorganic phosphate and NAD+, P+, go back to the light reaction so that the light reaction can happen again. Quick reminder, we did a lab about photosynthesis in class where we used spinach. This was actually a Saturday session, the first time we did it, and we measured the CO2 parts per million in that container. We had one condition where we shone light on the spinach and one where we had it in the dark. When we had the light on it, we saw the CO2 levels decrease because the spinach leaves were taking the CO2 out of the air for the Calvin cycle. When the spinach was in the dark, we saw the CO2 levels go up because we were seeing evidence of the cellular respiration that was happening in the spinach. So next up is cellular respiration. So as a reminder, cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen plus carbon dioxide, makes carbon dioxide, ATP, and water. The main processes are glycolysis, link reaction, Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Notice that glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. The other 3 are happening in the mitochondria. The oxidative phosphorylation is happening in that inner membrane of the mitochondria. We call this space in the middle of the mitochondria the mitochondrial matrix. We call the space between the 2 membranes the inner membrane space. And link reaction Krebs cycle oxidative phosphorylation will only happen if there's oxygen present, and we call that aerobic cellular respiration. When there's no oxygen present, anaerobic respiration happens, and that involves glycolysis and fermentation. Glycolysis breaks glucose to pyruvate, produces ATP. The NADPH that's made from the electron here is used in fermentation. And that NADP plus is then returned to glycolysis, so they're dependent on each other. There can be alcohol fermentation, which makes alcohol and CO2, or lactic acid fermentation, which makes lactic acid. Now, I drew out this diagram to show you in detail about cellular respiration again, but instead I'm going to have you watch the video that we made in class with the pop beads and everything, because I think that will be a better reminder.